Today is Friday, April 4, 2025, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. My name is John Robinson. I'm here again with my podcast co-host, Mr. Wallace G. Smith. Mr. Smith, did anybody try to prank you on April Fool's Day?
No. I think there were some Twitter accounts I saw where they had like a little tiny, thing, but thankfully, no, and certainly no one in the office because we don't do that kind of thing. There might be hijinks and other times alive. We don't do April Fools.
Hijinks, such a good word. I myself, one of the many things I like about working for the church and working at headquarters is not having to deal with coworkers. And I actually liked a lot of my coworkers at my last job, so that's not even an issue. It's just I prefer not having to deal with somebody who thinks it's hilarious to do an April Fool's prank.
Right.
I'm not pranky in general, let alone on April Fool's.
Let alone when we don't do it.
Okay, Mr. Smith, we have Passover and the Days of Unleavened Bread right around the corner here.
We do.
You have pulled together, I think, an excellent topic that will be appropriate for this time period. Why don't you let our listeners know what we're going to talk about today?
Sure, I will do that. It's a tale taken from the days, just like we're in these days leading up to Passover, actually a little bit earlier time-wise than it is in the Scripture, but there's a tale of a particular action taken by a woman in the days leading right up to the Passover, and it is the tale of the woman with her alabaster flask. And as I was reading it in my Passover preparations, it just struck me as one of those things that that there's a lot of value to meditating on. So I thought the day would be great for us to just, you and me together, meditate on some lessons from an alabaster flask.
No, that sounds good. Let's find out what's in that flask.
Welcome back, and here we are at the Living Youth Podcast. Very happy that you are listening. I tend to get pretty reflective, Mr. Robinson, before Passover. I know we all do. I don't say that like I'm any kind of unique person. But among the things I try to spend an appropriate amount of time focusing on things I really should be thankful about that sometimes go unconsidered or unweighed, or at least giving them the proper perspective they deserve. And among them, I'm very thankful for you, Mr. Robinson, and thankful for all you listeners and the feedback we get. And it always is encouraging. I know Mr. Robinson said the same thing when we go someplace and someone says, "Hey, I listen to the podcast." And anyway, it means a lot to us.
That never gets old.
It does never get old. So this particular story, I thought it'd be best to read it and just start off by reading it. And I picked the book of Mark. I don't know why, but I'll be reading it out of Mark. And just so there's not a lot of confusion. We don't want to dive into it. There are more than one instance. There is more than one instance in the Bible of a woman anointing Christ. The circumstances are different. The timing is slightly different. I'm focused on the one that's recorded right here in the book of Mark, and it's the one that's closest to the actual Passover coming. And let's see. I'll start reading it. Mark chapter 14. And I will read verses 3 through 9. So Mark 14, verses 3 through 9. I hope Mr. Senna likes that. I mentioned both verses, the beginning and the end. And you like it too, Mr. Robinson.
I am a fan.
I'm really thinking of trying to transition to that. All right, Mark chapter 14, I'll read verses 3 through 9. It says there, "And being in Bethany at the house of Simon the leper, as he," speaking of Jesus Christ, "sat at the table, a woman came having an alabaster flask of very costly oil of spikenard. Then she broke the flask and poured it," that is the spikenard, the oil that was on the inside, "on his head. But there were some who were indignant among themselves and said, 'Why was this fragrant oil wasted? For it might have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor.' And they criticized her sharply. But Jesus said, 'Let her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a good work for me. For you have the poor with you always, and whenever you wish, you may do them good. But me you do not have always. For she has done what she could. She has come beforehand to anoint my body for burial. Assuredly, I say to you, wherever this gospel is preached in the whole world, what this woman has done will also be told as a memorial to her." And on that last note, in verse 9, every time I talk about it, whether it's in a sermon or right now as a podcast, it's kind of cool because Christ's prophecy is being fulfilled in that moment. He said that every place this gospel goes, they're going to be talking about what this woman did. And here we are today, actually.
Yeah. 2025 podcasting about her.
That's
act.
right. Fulfilling prophecy,
Yep.
here in the podcast. So.
Well, there's a lot of ways to unpack this, Mr. Smith. Which direction do you want to go first?
Well, okay, that's a great question because there really are. And by the way, my plan today, and I appreciate Mr. Robinson's willingness, is I feel that kind of the biblical model about some things is to just ponder them a while and kind of take what lessons we can derive from thinking about them. My classic example is one that's not even a profound biblical circumstance like this certainly was, but is in the Proverbs when we have Solomon walking by the field of the lazy man, and he sees it overgrown with weeds and the walls kind of falling down, and he could just walk by that and think, oh man, this guy, what a terrible field. He clearly doesn't care about it, right? But instead, he says he took a moment and he pondered it and he drew lessons from that. It was a very mundane kind of circumstance. Honestly, my yard would probably give some people similar occasion in the past. I'm trying to do better about keeping my yard in shape. But that said, he saw it to kind of stay open. What might God teach me from seeing some? There's probably something to learn here. And so I really feel like in this, it's worth some meditating. And I think the best way to start is first to get a few facts out of the way. One fact of which, by the way, I'd like to save till later because I think it's such a neat point. I want to save it for when we make the point. But my first two facts I think is get out of the way is one, what is alabaster? It's clearly something kind of expensive. And why is this particular oil expensive? And when it comes to alabaster, I actually did not know until I was doing some of this study. I've always heard it, and it's like, I kind of think of it as kind of a stone or terracotta. But did you already know what alabaster was, Mr. Robinson?
Only very generally.
The only time I'd even think of it otherwise is when we're singing America the Beautiful, I think it is. Thine alabaster cities gleam undimmed by human tears. It's not America, speaking of the future. So it was a very, alabaster was a very soft stone, and because of its... because of the softness of it is something that you could work with. It would give this smooth kind of waxy feel to whatever you shaped with it.
I didn't know it was a stone. Is there any translucence to it?
Yes, and
Okay.
that's another benefit is it's kind of white and can even be worked with to a point that it can have a certain kind of a transparency to it. And as a result, it's sort of associated with real high quality craftsmanship. To own alabaster items was often a sign of your wealth. I think sometimes it really had to be imported, even sometimes from other places. So first you have this vase, which is, and how much is it worth? It's so funny. If you read like the Old King James, it'll say 300 pence. And pence is kind of like change, and at least but when I think of British money, I think of my change being pence. But it does say 300 denarii. In other places, a denarii is denoted as like a day's wage or so. So you're looking at potentially almost a year's salary, for something.
Well,
like
the
this.
John account makes it clear that it's a year's worth.
Okay,
Well,
there you.
It's clearer.
Yeah,
I actually think that's a far better way. I've thought about this. Speaking of meditating, that's a far better way to convey the cost. Because it is hard. Like I can't remember what it was. I was trying to calculate the modern cost of something, and it was a lot. But even then, it was just a big guess. I mean, all the commentaries are like, "Well, you could kind of figure it this way." A 1 year's wages is something I think that directly translates for us.
Yeah.
So what if I hate to even make up numbers, but let's say your annual salary was $50 or $75 or $100,000. So let's say $100,000.
Oh wow.
That's a pretty significant expense.
It is.
That's you could have bought 3 cars. You can't buy a house anymore for you could have a down payment for a house.
Yeah.
Like, if nothing else, what that says to me is, oh wow, this was not merely expensive.
Yeah.
This was
is stunning in its
Yeah.
and then even if you say go on the other side, maybe you're just starting out, you're working, you're new at Chick-fil-A, and I don't know what Chick-fil-A wages are these days. Let's say you're just starting out, and so it's, I don't know, you're making $15,000, right? You're not moving out on that money yet, but you're working on it. I'm sorry, this is still one vase full of oil that's $15,000, right? I mean, regardless, I'm sure a day's wage really differed based on the worker, but you're talking about what's generally accepted. Like your random person you'd pull off the street, a day's wage for them. And now imagine an entire year's worth of working, and it's all summed up in this one vase.
Yep. That's incredible.
And now part of the vase, its value is not just the vase itself, but also the oil in it, the oil of spikenard, or I don't know if I should have looked how it's pronounced. It could be spikenard. Apparently sometimes it's just called nard, which to me just sounds funny. Sounds like a college nickname. Hey, go over there and get nard, this guy. But yeah, it was also expensive. It often had to be transported to come. The oil that's made from this particular flower, this plant, was very aromatic, and it was considered a real high quality, rare oil. It wasn't just something you had lying around. So to actually have an amount of spikenard, so you have this contents, and it's a year's worth. It's a year of someone's salary wrapped up in one particular object, and so you start to see, thinking carnally, how some of these people would say, she literally just poured all of that on. That's a year's salary for someone, just kind of poured on this guy's head. So anyway, that I think the facts are important.
The other thing that you found out that I thought even added more to this was you're finding out this was a one-use item.
Yeah, that's the fact that I want to focus on there towards the end. Later? That's right. That's all right. It's all good.
I kind of I've learned. I get excited about a data point and find out that's the one you're holding for later. I was like, let's talk about this now.
Well, that's, in the notes where I have in brackets, one more detail to save. That's what that, But however, no, let's go ahead and bring that out. Because if you look at the text, it says there in verse, I want to make sure I read it. Oh, it says in verse 3 right there at the beginning, it says she broke the flask and poured it on his head. So that made the flask, think of it, that much more valuable. This was not like a flask that was intended for multiple uses. That oil is so valuable and stuff. Sometimes you would put it in something that it's given a permanent seal. Now, that would, in one sense, kind of help you prevent from spilling it, right? But it's kind of like when you're using it, you got to be committed because you're literally breaking this thing open. You could almost think of it as, even though it's not an emergency in this case, like you break the glass to get to the thing to stop the fire or to pull the fire alarm or whatever the case is. This is something that this 1 year's worth of salary item is about to become worth no day's salary item because it's about to be a broken vase just for the sake of getting to it is true. And that only added to the value of it. When you gave it to someone, you're really giving them something very special because it's when it is used, it would be actually kind of like those I've never had this, but you hear about people having just wine or some kind of scotch that is incredibly old, and it's just valuable to have on your shelf. And yet the whole purpose is to be used one day. And then one day you're going to crack that one open and maybe share a glass for a special occasion. I
love it. So what we could say, just as we've kicked it off here, is at the very least, it would, I think, it'd be easy to a modern reader to not fully grasp how valuable this was and what a tremendous sacrifice it was to use it here. And this woman, we don't get her name here, interestingly, seemed to have the authority to open it. There's no sense.
It might have been one she owned, who made part of her hope chest or something.
Yep.
Really
maybe
know.
She'd been given that as an investment or something.
Yeah, like for a dowry or something.
Right. But regardless, she has decided this is the time that this sacrifice needs to be made. I think that's very much a hidden theme through here of sacrifice. She's sacrificing something of great value to her, and she has decided this is the time to use it, and literally has to break it out as it were. And why? It's for the preparation and even the acknowledgement of the great sacrifice Christ himself is going to be making shortly. And that might be a good way to pivot into the reaction, which subtly is an indication of how little the disciples seemed to understand what was about to happen.
I thought that's a great observation, because they do have a certain cluelessness throughout. Christ keeps highlighting to them that, man, I'm going to die, right? And they do get the impression that going to Jerusalem was kind of a big moment, but I think they saw it as more the big gamble. Either, we're all going to die, or else we're going to be triumphant, he's going to be, but not realizing, no, I'm going to die and you are not at this time. And this is me I'm going to sacrifice myself in a way that nobody in the world would even consider valuable. But you do pick up on certain females getting it. Like in this case, there's some sense that people recognize he's truly giving of himself in a way that the disciples don't seem that his male disciples there, they just don't seem to get.
Yes, yes. That reminds me of one of my subpoints, which was, I'm kind of calling it focus, and that's just a broad term for where was everyone's orientation? What were they focused on? What was important to them? And as you just alluded to, I think this is a good time to mention Luke 10 and 38 through 42. It's the kind of semi-humorous story of one sister complaining about the other sister not helping. I'll just read it quickly.
Yeah.
And now it happened as they went. This is Luke 10 and verse 38. Now it happened as they went that he, being Christ, entered a certain village, and a certain woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. And she had a sister called Mary, who also sat at Jesus' feet and heard his word. But Martha was distracted with much serving, and she approached him and said, and I always make a hand gesture when I do this, Lord, I just envision her gesturing towards her sister. Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Therefore tell her to help me. And Jesus answered and said, Martha, Martha, you are worried and troubled about many things, but one thing is needed, and Mary has chosen that good part which will not be taken away from her. Now, you wonder how consciously, say, Mary was aware of this, but either way, there was a limited amount of time that Christ was going to be on the earth to sit there literally at his feet and hear his preaching and teaching.
Right.
And you wonder if, it's going back to the story of the alabaster oil, if maybe there was an awareness too that like kind of we've run out of time. If there's ever a time to use this very valuable thing as I think it represents many things. But anyway, this is the time's up. This is the time to use it.
Yeah, think about it. What if she hadn't? What greater use could it be put to, right? I mean, who else could she have anointed that would be greater, and what other kind of way? And that, I think that's definitely worth plumbing. The story of Mary and Martha is just so fantastic. It does remind me of a comment my wife made recently. She was talking about among the many things, say, tasks that she will do, or that we will do, like mowing the lawn. I try to mow the lawn, but every once in a while she'll mow the lawn. She'll get out there. Maybe it's like, I'm just going to go ahead and do it, because she actually finds a lot of satisfaction in it sometimes, because you mow a lawn, it stays that way for a few days. It looks pretty good. She says versus, say, cleaning the house. It's like by the end of the day, it's like, well, what did I even do?
Yeah.
I can't even tell anymore.
Well, just skip it a few days and you'll find out.
Yeah, so I was thinking about poor Martha in that example. It's like, I don't think Christ would say it this way at all. But it's like, Martha, you'll get to do this tomorrow too. It's not like, this is an everyday thing. But this was a unique moment to learn from Christ and recognizing that was the more valuable thing at that time.
Because Martha's, I would argue Martha's not really reprimanded for this. She's working hard, serving everybody.
Exactly.
But it's just like sometimes you gotta weigh. You gotta put together the hierarchy of what's important. And then while that is important to help and serve and do all those things that are sometimes thankless, this is kind of a one-off opportunity here.
Yeah, that's a great turn of phrase. I'll use it to transition to another point. The hierarchy of what's important, because part of that is what's highlighted here. On one hand, you look at some of the complaints, the various ones. And we know in the other example about Judas complaining because he just wanted some of that money. But here they all kind of jumped on this woman, right? Possibly inspired by some of Judas's other thinking. However, Jesus doesn't seem to be critical about taking care of the poor. In fact, there's other times, even like whenever the wealthy young man comes to him and says, what more do I need to do to be saved? He goes, sell everything you have and give it to the poor and follow me. Now, it wasn't just for the sake of selling and giving to the poor, but no, remove all that stuff in your life that frankly you're addicted to, which come to find out he was, and then follow me instead. But no, Christ wasn't anti-helping the poor. And it does remind me, like Mr. Weston encouraging all of us to do what we can for our neighbors, not to always look to institutions or to look to the Red Cross or all these other things, but what can we do to actually truly help? Now, Jesus wasn't anti-helping the poor, but what he highlights here, because a lot of people would say the same thing, oh, you're putting all that money, on this. You could have fed. In fact, think about it. If that's truly a day's wages, then you're looking at least 1,000 meals for the poor. Think of 3 meals a day, right? That you're looking at 1,000 meals that could have gone to poor and hungry individuals or cloaks and yet what this example highlights is, as much as our society might want to say that's the ultimate good is pouring all your funds and helping other people, no, sometimes there is a better use of them. In this particular case, bringing honor and glory to Jesus Christ for the role that he was about to, that actually was a greater use of this than feeding the poor, if you will, and serving them. Like
Yes.
Christ says, look, they're
Yep.
all, you could take all your money and give it to them
Yep.
and they're still going to be there. You don't have me
Yep.
with you forever.
You know, Dr. Meredith would make that point very well from time to time. And I remember one of the examples he used was, I'm pretty sure this is his story. He'd had a chance to go to India, and you get out and you see all these extremely poor people, and they were starting to get some money out to help them. And I think their driver said, "Whoa, don't do that. You're gonna get a lot of people trying to get money from you."
Mm-hmm.
But his point was, the amount of people that were extremely poor that you could help was endless, and that we could take all the worked resources and pour it in, and it would have some benefit, and it would temporarily alleviate some suffering. But when you compare that to the opportunity cost, which is you're not doing the work anymore, which is clearly the most important thing on Christ's mind. He says that very clearly many times, to do the work of his Father was the most important thing. Therefore, that's the most important thing to us as an organization and as a people called together for that purpose. The thing that we need to be doing and focused on the more is telling people how to change their lives long term, if I can oversimplify the gospel message in that way. I mean, it is the gospel message we've always had of the four components of it, a king, subjects, laws, territory. It's all that, but it's also hope, and you can change your life now by making certain things, and you can alleviate suffering just by following God's laws. And kind of off in the weeds here a little bit, but anyway, you start to realize that some of these women seem to recognize the uniqueness of their opportunity and that this wasn't going to last forever, whereas the disciples at that time still seemed to kind of think, I don't know, they didn't seem to really have the end. Well, no, they did have the end in mind, I would argue, which seemed to be thinking that Christ was actually going to bring about the kingdom now, and which he was not.
Right.
to.
Maybe I can find some of the feedback that people have given us. I might encourage people to go and read that old Living Church News article, the title, I think You Are Making a Difference. But yeah, there are things that we can do in this world to alleviate physical suffering. And if you go to, say, Matthew 25, Christ even talks about that. He talks about how when you've helped, someone in need, a little one, it's like you've helped me. When you've visited someone who's being persecuted, it's like you visited me. He really does care about that, especially in the body of Christ, to be sure. And yet at the same time, in our world, we've kind of institutionalized all of that sort of thing, where it's not really, you look at, like, say, all the protest in 2020, take your social media account and change it to have a flag on it, or, black out the your icon, whatever the case is. We've kind of institutionalized all that, and as if that's somehow what he's talking about in Matthew 25 versus actually personally helping someone. And yet at the same time, even then, we especially our society that is so secular, all we can think of is the mechanisms of helping people. We don't have a larger message. And Christ is very plain here that, look, that's kind of what you get in society, and you're always going to have that in society. That's the way that is. There are times when there are higher uses of those things, and glorifying Jesus Christ and putting forward his work and highlighting what he is doing in the world, that is at times a higher priority. And I really didn't think of it until now, but like when we get letters come in, there was one letter in particular just recently, because I remember reading it to someone or using it in a sermon, where this fellow wrote into the magazine. I think he wrote specifically to Mr. Weston, but he talked, I might have read on the podcast, I'm not sure. It didn't come in recently. It was just one that came to my attention again recently. How he went on and on about how our telecast in the magazine, it's made him a better man than he was. And he's so grateful. And he went on about how it's just made such an impact and a difference in his life. And think, he's actually been touched by the way of Jesus Christ and the life that he lived and what it means for the life you can live. And that's an inestimable a gift to give somebody. That is not nothing. That's someone who is looking at his life anew and realizing he has potential he's never considered. He has a relationship with God that he can actually have in his life. And that is far more valuable than, say, giving him another meal for the day or giving him a nice coat. Now, don't get me wrong. Those things are good. I'm not trying to detract from those things. But there's some things that only the church can do. only the church of God can actually give people the true meaning to their lives, a true understanding of what salvation is. We can work hard and pour, literally, like you just mentioned, every dollar the church ever receives into trying to help improve people's physical lives,
Right.
or we can help them see the purpose of their life, which when you fully understand it, you'd be willing to give up that physical life for. You'd actually be willing to sacrifice that physical life for that larger purpose. And that's literally the job that Christ has called, that God has called the church to, and the body of Christ to. And so, yeah, there are times that clearly does override that. And to me, her using this year's salary worth of gift to focus the world on Jesus Christ, it meant so much. Jesus Christ literally says that, yeah, she could have fed the poor with that, and they would still be there, and no one would ever remember. But what she did here, people will be talking about forever. They will be talking about this one single action everywhere this gospel goes.
Yes. You know, one of the commentaries I use likes to, they don't always do it, but they work in their own translation of it, which is interesting. It's just, hey, here's another way it could be rendered, and we're just always trying to get the best sense of what's going on here. And they said that there's a couple ways you could view Christ's reaction, and one is you could translate it, she has done a beautiful thing to me, or she has done a beautiful work. And so again, you know, to contrast Christ's perspective on it from the reaction of the others in the room, which is very, very different. Christ saw this as this beautiful, wonderful thing, as he knew his time was drawing to a close. And, you know, again, not to be too hard on the disciples and others, just not.
Well, they didn't have the whole picture yet. I let me say this: I probably made 100 different judgments of that kind of stuff over the course of my life, and not really realizing the full point.
You know, one thing I would like to mention, and this might be as good a place as any for it, is, which was quite interesting to me when I thought about this. So Mark is one of the earliest Gospels that were written. And so that was out really relatively quick after Christ's death. Relative is a key word there. And this episode he records here, it happens in time sequence later than the one that John records. But John's Gospel is not written until 30, 40 years later. And so I was thinking about how when you read John's account of a different account, and he brings in an important data point, which is, oh, by the way, Judas was stealing
money from the treasury.
From the treasury. And so then that little data point, I think, informs this one a little bit, which is, here's this indignant attitude about how the money could have been spent when you really put it in perspective, which I think you've done a great job, like focusing on what a great sacrifice this was by this woman. Just a selfless act in recognition of the Christ and what's going on here. And then by comparison, you start to realize when you think about it that, one, it's possible that Judas was actually possibly influencing the other disciples a little bit to like, hey, yeah, what is this all about? How come we are using the money in this way? But Judas, that's not trying to help the poor people. He's going to skim it off the top. So it's just all the more the juxtaposition of the two very different attitudes and reactions and purposes behind what's being done and said here is really quite remarkable when you stop and meditate about it.
Right. It's interesting because this account, which I think happens late, because the one you mentioned is earlier, and they might have just been remembered his comments from earlier, and then it kind of had spread. But at the same time, his whole motivation was not that. I am not getting political when I say this, but it's interesting when you do have successful efforts to help others, right? These kind of philanthropic efforts. It's interesting how you see them sometimes grow to the point they become an industry into themselves, and people get attached. And next thing you know, you have these organizations that are devoted to helping people, and yet their CEOs and stuff are just raking in cash, so much. And then you start more and more of your dollars that you're donating to them are actually going to pay for their salaries, their vacations, and not actually going to individuals.
Oh man, what a great point! That reminds me of a very, very old data point I have in my brain, which was my father-in-law. Well, that gets confusing. Not Mr. Strain, Mr. Walden, my original father-in-law. He had done some research and found that that most charitable organizations, only about 10% of what's donated to them actually gets out to other people.
Oh, wow, really?
That the administrative cost can be as high as 90%.
Wow.
In which case you've kind of lost the purpose.
Yeah, and hey, you guys got to go out there and do your own research and see if that's still the case. But I do know, and we have an article coming out, I think, by Mr. Wakefield. We do, just so everyone knows, the church does do charitable things here and there. Like recently, when the hurricane came through, we actually looked into the areas that were devastated not far from us, and did some investigating to see, well, what are the organizations that are, one, really helping people, not just ones that are, that have big names and show up. We actually talked to people in the region to say, who are the ones out there that are really making a difference, and then looked into them to make sure that if they were given money, it would truly go to people. And, and then when that was the case, then yeah, we did have money we contributed to try to help and try to make a difference. But that was after it was quick and it was intense, but it was a lot of research, because we do want to make sure that money's actually going where it is. And so yeah, it's not that Christ, again, is against doing good works, quite the opposite. And yet at the same time, in this world, there's a lot of people out there hustling. In fact, I can use hustle to make the switch. This is a side note. It's not that hefty, but I do kind of want to highlight that. I don't know if there's a name for the culture out there. I'll call it the hustle bro culture, that are all about, hey, what's your side hustle? What are you doing? You got to grow. You got to often taking advantage of young men in particular. I say take advantage. It's a mixture of good advice and bad advice. Like the good advice often is, hey, when you're young, I would say biblically, that's when your strength is your glory. There's things you can accomplish in your youth that you can't accomplish when you're older, and so try to accomplish them. But then it becomes an end unto itself. I even saw one fellow add to his advice, and you know what? It's a good time to get a vasectomy, because then you won't have any children and you can just focus. Oh yeah, it was absolutely the worst advice I think I've read in the last year and a half. But anyway, it was truly terrible. But that said, there's something to be said for a certain kind of. Well, people say sometimes of those on the political left, they're bleeding hearts. They're throwing money, at the poor that's so unprofitable. The poor really aren't all that helped. What you really should do is this and this. And so you go on the political right. And then often in that case, it's like, if we could take that money and then we could invest it, we could have even more money to be able to help. But then the help actually doesn't tend to flow, right? So it'd be easy to say, that much, really? Couldn't she have used a cheaper oil? Couldn't she have, surely there's cheaper oil around. She could have taken that and invested it more. And just think, when the church really needed it, she could have used that to fund a building or to fund this.
Right.
And so it's always easy to think that. But there's times when, no, we just give to God, whether it's our efforts, whatever it is, and we let Him multiply it, right? We don't, like, in this case, what she could have sold that for, who knows what. However, what it did earn, even if it was, you just think of it as just for her, it has earned praise for her that has gone on for 2,000 years. She will come up in one resurrection or the other. I presume she was a follower of Christ and was eventually converted. And will actually go on into eternity. She actually got something for eternity. And here we are benefiting 2,000 years later from an act that she did. There's times when we got to be careful not to get up in that kind of hustle bro culture and realize, you know what? Forget what I can do with this. I'm gonna lay this at Christ's feet and see what He can do with it.
Right.
And just truly give this over to Him.
Well, looking at the notes and seeing where you're going, which I'd see you start to elaborate on your next point, it made me think of what you just said. Is I just have something I would like to add after you make your next point.
The next point.
Right there.
All right. Well, so then as we transition to the next point, I want to make sure I highlight part of why I found this profitable for Passover as it's coming up, and which, again, whether we're baptized or, I say again, I haven't said this yet, but whether we're baptized or not, everyone can examine themselves. If you're young out there and you're a teenager and you haven't come to baptism yet, still a great time for self-examination. It's the season, 'tis the season, if you will. All of these things I try to use to press myself to ask, well, what if I were in her spot, right? Or am I making these kinds of sacrifices? So do think of that in that kind of sense. The next point I thought was the comment that he makes in verse 8. He says of her there, she has done what she could. I thought that was an interesting choice of phrase, that she's done what she could. On one hand, it's vital to understand God doesn't judge people for what they can't do.
Right.
You might feel, we've had people who send in like tithes or offerings, and I'll see it sometimes in the letters to the editor where someone writes in, they says, "Hey, I've included a small gift. I'm so sorry I can't do more." They just wish they could do more. And the fact is, God isn't saying, "Boy, me too. I just can't, boy." No, sometimes that's all you have, and it's amazing. Like the widow's 2 mites.
Yeah, exactly.
That was a tiny part that the widow threw in. He didn't go, "But what a waste." That's not going to get it. It's barely going to get one piece of paper, 1 page on 1 magazine. But God doesn't look at it that way. The fact is, she did at the limits of what she could do, to be sure, probably. But at the same time, she did what she could, and God loves that.
Yeah, He really does. I love that about God. He's so fair, and in ways you don't always, they don't immediately come to mind. In this case, highlighting, no matter what situation you're in, your effort and your resources, God takes into account what you had, and man, that's really nice to know that you don't have to be a wealthy person to be considered, oh, what a contribution he made to the work. What mattered is what you did with your time and your resources you had at hand.
Yeah, it does remind me of Mr. Gerald Weston's coworker letters, and I hope you read those. Just because you're, some of you are young, don't think oh, there comes a letter from the church, I'll need to read it. No, do read that. That's the presiding evangelist who has something important to say. And, I review those as part of the process. We're kind of making sure it's good and clean before it goes out. And I'm always impressed with how he actively works, because we have some people who give, small amounts, right? They just, a little donation is all they can do, and that's what they do. And then we have other people, like, say, donate the value of their home.
Yes.
They sell, they some people who leave us in their will or something. And there's some, Mr. Weston works very hard, and he's explicit about it. He doesn't make a special effort to, that worldly, that's what you think you would do. The ones who are the really big donors, you think, oh, thank you for this vast, donation. Thank you so much. We're going to do so much. We're going to be able to print all these magazines and this and that. And Mr. Weston explicitly, and he even mentions it in the letter, that he tries very hard to resist the temptation to do that, because, I would say for 2 reasons. He explicitly at least mentions one, is that, for the wealthy, a donation of $10,000 might be easy.
Yes.
And for the person who's struggling, that $5 they send in might have been the limits of what they could possibly give anybody. Why would he praise the one and be so grateful for the one and not for the other? Jesus Christ wasn't that way. People were donating all this stuff at the temple, and Jesus drew the disciples' attention to the widow and her 2 mites. That's what got the eyes of the Creator and the Savior of the world, was that woman's small donation because of what it represented to her. And Mr. Weston, he says that later, he goes, I don't want to fall into that trap.
Right.
For those of you who are giving this 2 mites, thank you every bit as much. It's every bit as important. And then the other side of that is what Christ can do with it. Who knows what Christ will turn that money into, right?
Exactly. Well, you know what? I was going to say rant.
I'll take it.
What you just brought out there made me think of, I always found this humorous. Non-religious sources refer to this, what I'm about to describe, as the multiplicity of the fishes and the loaves. What God can do with very limited resources. I mean, he owns everything, so at some point it's kind of, well, of course, but he took couple fish and a handful of loaves and fed thousands of people. I mean, he can take a very, very small thing and make it multiply it so much that it is effective and feeds a lot of people. I did want to say one thing about this before we move on. You said here she has done what she could, and that which led me into also intrigue about the next thing he says. But before we do that, in verse 5, and I have 3 different translations here, and they all, you can see how like intense the criticism was. So in the New King James, verse 5, it says, and they criticized her sharply. Another translation said they spoke angrily to her. Another one said they scolded her harshly. So that, the outrage was intense.
Right.
But when Christ comes out and defends her and says she has done what she could, which you've made great points on, but also he says why she has come beforehand to anoint my body for burial, and it's kind of subtle unless you sit back and think about it, but like he pivoted their criticism of her firmly onto him. It's like, this is actually for me. Oh, and by the way, because I'm about to die, I think we've all lost some perspective there, but he makes it like, if you're criticizing her, this was done to anoint my body for burial. So what you're really doing ignorantly is you're sharply criticizing the purpose of this sacrifice and
devaluing his sacrifice, which was going to be about to be the greatest sacrifice that any living person has ever given.
That was kind of my final point I wanted to make on that. We don't have to go on about it.
Oh, no, I would like to make another one. No,
Okay,
I don't know if I was inspired by what you said or it just kind of came to me, but I want to highlight to our listeners that, we're talking about finances here and there because this is a real expensive thing the woman did, but don't think of it don't think of it just as that way in terms of she has done what she could. For instance, let's say you're at services and you have someone who is naturally an extrovert, and to go around the room and to check on people and how they were doing this week and to kind of glad hand in a negative way, shake hands at people and cheer everybody up and encourage people for the next week. It's just natural for them. They're just like born encouragers, and it's what they do. And they do it like breathing. It's like a fish swimming, doesn't even think about it. And maybe you have another who is far more introverted, that the idea of even reaching out to one person is kind of an intimidating thing. They come to services and they want to, get their nose in the bottom. Well, for that person to just kind of go outside of themselves just a bit to see maybe an elderly man sitting there or someone in the congregation that nobody is talking to, and to just even awkwardly reach out and go, I want to go check on him. I just want to go say hi and make sure he knows he's thought of or something. God sees that as well, right? And maybe it went awkwardly. It's like, I didn't know what to say. And we kind of sat there quietly for a time and nobody was saying something. And then you say something else awkwardly and you think, why did I say that? That's the dumbest thing ever. But the person kind of responds. You realize they're into it. They're trying. And then you walk away. Well, you might compare those two people and think, well, one person virtually talked to 75% of the people there and made them feel like they're the only person in the room versus, you really stretching to talk to that one person that you didn't really know very well, and it feels awkward. You don't know them because you've been in the same congregation for, a couple years. And yet, man, God looks at that. You were like the widow's two mites there. You didn't have as much to give in a sense as the person who's naturally an extrovert. But man, God loved that. God loved that you put that effort in there and that you did what you could. The woman's alabaster flask, it was what she could. It was on the high end of what she could. She could have used some sheep oil too, but she did the most of what she could. And if that was a stretch for you that day, God noticed that. So we're not really just talking about finances. We're talking about sacrifice in the broader sense.
That reminds me of an old saying I heard probably 30 years ago, but it always stuck with me, which was, there are those that know the price of everything and the value of nothing.
Oh, look at you, Mr. Robinson.
Thank you.
Pulling out the big quotes.
So even though these guys are squabbling over something that by all accounts was fairly valuable, the price of it was nothing compared to the sacrifice that Christ was about to make.
Oh, yeah. Doesn't even compare.
But his life was worth the sum value of all of humanity is notable. And then you think about, what is a man's life worth to him? It's essentially priceless. We would sacrifice anything just to maintain our lives in this temporary existence.
And this was the actual value of the life of the Creator himself. Really, I was thinking about that actually just this morning. He, by condescending to come in the flesh, the Word went from an existence we can't even fathom to just becoming a regular man. That would be like, if for some reason this is some goofy Disney movie or something where I'm transformed into a mosquito. Let's just say some stupid animated movie. Well, that would be a tremendous, I hope you think well enough of me to think that would be a tremendous downgrade. I've gone from being a human being who can write and think and love, and now I'm a mosquito. And yet, I personally, I think the gap there is minuscule compared to the gap of going from being God to being this little fleshy body. Yes. And now, why did he do that? Well, to give up to even that, he reduced himself to just being a humble servant. And why? For the sake, ultimately, of even giving that up, literally giving everything up. So that is something of inestimable value. And I think we can hit this second to last thing pretty briefly, and I think you approached it really well. because verse 5 highlights how it says they're really, I love how you had the different translations, because they just criticized her sharply and they scolded her, really just got onto her for what she did. Well, to me, it's a good reminder that you can expect criticism in the world for the kind of choices that you make. When some people discover that you tithe, or that you spend 2 weeks at a camp when you could have done this other thing, whatever it is that you do in service of the church, the fact that you spend 2 hours every Sunday, you always go, what about this and what about that? What about the other things you could be doing? And then forget just 2 hours, there's the fellowship before and after, and anyway, the sacrifices that we make, we should expect criticism for those sacrifices, just like she got, and also, frankly, for the same reasons Mr. Robinson has highlighted so well. Because those, if you don't know, you don't know. And those who don't understand the value of salvation and what this way of life is, they don't know. And so the sacrifices we make, whether they're financial, whether they're of our time, whether they're of our energy, whether they're just of our social life, whatever it is, whether it's just simply the things we could do if we were in the world that we choose not to do because we want to raise our activities and our choices to a higher level, they don't understand the value of those things. And just like they didn't understand the value of what Christ was about to do. And so just don't judge them for that, in a sense. They didn't, just kind of like we're not trying to overly judge them. Christ definitely called them on the carpet for it. But I would say he could have gotten worse, but he didn't. He just kind of used it as an instructive moment for them. You should expect people not to understand what you're doing.
Yep. That reminds me of a few other scriptures I'll read here in a moment. This woman took probably the most valuable thing she has, and she sacrificed it for that moment with Christ, whose life was going to end soon. And it reminds me of advice we're given in Matthew 13, verses 44 and 46. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and hid. And for joy over it, he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant selling beautiful pearls. So when he had found one pearl of great price, went and sold all that he had and bought it. And I think that's one of the things I really appreciate the most out of what this woman did, whose sacrifice 2,000 years ago, as Christ said, is still being talked about to this day, is it's hard to think anything other than she was all in. Whatever I have, whatever it takes, I'm going to sacrifice it so that I can be with Christ, both there temporarily and in the future.
And that is exactly what is important in this last point I want to make. And this is the one that I'm so glad Mr. Robinson was excited about it. It seemed like when we talked about it a bit yesterday that it caught your attention too, because I never really understood about why the flask had to be broken, right? It was because they would do these flasks and kind of permanently seal them in these cases, and it made it that much more valuable. And in this case, the fact that she had to break that flask to get to that oil, it meant that her sacrifice was irreversible. There was no going back. It wasn't like a flask you just open the top, use some of the oil, even use it all, but then refill it later, and you still got this great flask.
I'll save some to freshen up later.
That's right. This was it. Just like Mr. Robinson said a while ago, she was all in. This was a permanent and irreversible commitment. And that is what Jesus Christ is looking for in all of us. He's looking for a no going back attitude in terms of committing to who he is and what he wants us to do versus what everybody else expects.
It reminds me of that old, it's old, Columbus or somebody, Christopher Columbus did it. You burn the ships. They sailed halfway across the world, and to keep people committed to the mission they were on there, they burned the ships.
Yeah, I don't know. We need Mark Sandor here to tell us if it's apocryphal or not, but I think it was Cortez. I'm not sure, but yeah.
Okay.
But I always thought about, but they got to get back eventually. What are they, but anyway, the old story, that's right. We are maybe our readers who are more historians will correct us on who it was. But yeah, that idea of, no, we're burning the ships. We're here.
Well, there's just, if you really make it your focus, and, it's a good time to be reading through the Gospels right now, there is a very important and deep theme that is, what are you focused on? And it makes me think of that. It's one of the best understandings of Christ walking on water. That as long as Peter was focused on Christ, he was literally able to walk on water. And once he lost that focus and the storms distracted him around him, he fell. So we have to keep our focus, and that there's nothing that we have in this life. Nothing that is more valuable than the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. So whatever it takes for us to do what we have to do to be there, and be judged righteous and get to be with Christ for all of eternity, you just make that sacrifice. That you have to be all in.
Yeah. It apparently was Cortez.
Okay,
by the
good.
way. And so by some accounts, he scuttled them. So it didn't necessarily burn them. However, part of why that could work is because they'd already sent word back to Spain to come back, but they were committed to conquering the Aztec Empire. It's like we're not going to be fleeing.
Boy,
we are going to conquer the Aztecs.
That could be a whole other podcast.
That would be a whole other podcast.
I tell you what, actually, for human reasonings and human drive, Cortez was all in on that.
And you put it so well, but that is exactly what Jesus Christ is looking for. I've really appreciated some of these observers who've noted things about marriage, about child rearing, about things that are honestly some of the most important things in this world. You honestly don't truly accomplish them unless you're really all in on them. You don't have everything your marriage could be unless you have decided,
yes,
man, kind of like the What's Her Name song, but I'm going down with this ship. This is it. We are committed to this thing. Same thing with child rearing. You want, when I see articles in the New York Times where it's women writing about how their life only got better, and even their relationship with their children, once they realized their family needed to be second place or third place or lower on the scale, you realize, wow, there's no way long-term that's going to work. It might look great maybe even great until your children are raising their children, but that will always go sour because the great institutions of God that he's given us and the design of his plan, and just being a Christian, it requires an all-in mentality that whatever this takes. Mr. Ames used to put it that way about marriage. He goes, people talk about marriage being 50-50. He says it's not. Marriage is about being 100%, 100%. It's about being completely, it's not just meeting each other halfway. It's imagine your fingers completely enfolding, the other hand. You've got to be completely all in. God is looking for all of us to be willing to work with him in tomorrow's world. He knows those who are committed to it because they're willing to sacrifice today's world. He knows that tomorrow's world means more to them than today's world does.
In that moment, the disciples and others criticizing this woman's act, they got caught up in the moment and they lost some perspective. And I have to think that a couple days later, when it still took them by surprise, Christ was arrested and crucified, and they saw him and they witnessed him die, and they take him down, and then at that point he's being wrapped in the cloth, prepared to go in.
Yeah.
And how would you feel? How would I feel if I'd been there and I was like, yeah, that's a good point. Why is this being, maybe even say wasted on something like this? And you think, just 2 days ago, that woman made this great sacrifice for Christ, and here he is having died. And I'll bet you would sit back and think about it.
Yeah. I know how could you not, right? How could you not? The last verse I'll mention that seems related to this to me, at least it came to my mind, is at the end of Hebrews chapter 10, where we have Paul writing in Hebrews talking about our need for endurance. It's just a little while longer. He keeps saying, and it's a quote from the Old Testament, but he puts a context in it when he says in Hebrews chapter 10, I'll just start in verse 38. It says, "Now the just shall live by faith, but if anyone draws back, my soul has no pleasure in him." And then Paul adds his commentary, says, "But we are not of those who draw back to perdition, but of those who believe to the saving of the soul." That sense that belief in Jesus Christ and who he is and what he is for us and what he is doing in the world and what God sent him to do and what he is now and accomplishing in us, that belief is contrasted here with the spirit of drawing back and not being willing to be completely all in. And I think it's one of the great lessons from this woman in a worthwhile meditation during Passover is asking the question, are we all in? Because this one woman with this one really expensive flask 2,000 years ago, she took criticism for it. People scolded her for it, and a lot of people in the world would just think it was a crazy call. And yet she showed with one broken flask that she was 100% all in, like we all need to be.